Welcome to this meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club. The Socratic Club is inspired by C.S. Lewis, the well-known Christian apologist and author who wrote a number of popular books, including Mere Christianity, The Abolition of Man, The Great Divorce, and you're probably familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia series as well. We take our inspiration from the Oxford Socratic Club, which Lewis presided over for a number of years from the 40s to the 50s at Oxford University. Its theme was to follow the argument wherever it leads, and we try to do that here at the Gonzaga Socratic Club as well, especially looking at issues of faith and reason, which is not only a good topic for an Anglican apologist like C.S. Lewis, but it's also an appropriate topic for a Jesuit Catholic humanist university like Gonzaga. We are very privileged today to have a presentation that directly speaks to C.S. Lewis's life and his work. Today we're going to look at a presentation about the Kilns, the home that Lewis owned and lived in for about 33 years. On the outskirts of Oxford. Our speaker today is not only a scholar in her own right. She has degrees in medieval English literature from Oxford University and a master in teaching from Duke University. She's not only a scholar in that sense, she also runs her own company. She's a web designer. But maybe most important for our purposes today is she was the residential director. I'm going to mess up the title here. I should look at it to make sure I get it right. She was the the academic coordinator and residential director at the Kilns. The Kilns is now owned by a foundation, and it's available for people to visit. I'm sure she'll have more to tell us about that in a moment. But our speaker today is Miss Lydia Newell. If you'd please welcome her.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for coming this afternoon. It is a delight to be here. It's kind of fun to take a break from the web development, from all that code, and get back into the beauties of the written word. So, yes, C.S. Lewis, scholar and author, lived at the Kilns from 1930 when he purchased the home and lived in until his death in 1963. And so I'm going to give you a sort of abbreviated version of the tour I would give to visitors of the Kilns. That tour took upwards of an hour, so I'm going to try and condense it a little bit this afternoon, and I will try to stay within my recommended 35 minutes. But one thing I'd like to suggest, and I think this is maybe a little out of format for this group, is that if you see something while I'm talking that you have a question about, please feel free to go ahead and ask that question right away, because just as if we were in the real house, sometimes people would see something or have a question that related directly to something that we were seeing. So again, please feel free to ask questions at any point. I'm fine with that. I enjoy that. So once again, C.S. Lewis. So I've titled my presentation "A Year at the Kilns." I actually worked there for about 18 months, from August of 2008 until December of 2009. So I got to enjoy about 18 months of the season changing and hundreds of visitors through our doors, and I also did a lot of teaching during that time for a number of Oxford undergraduate programs. So I was pretty saturated from the inside out with Lewis and his activities. And so the Kilns is about 3 miles outside of Oxford, about 3 miles to the east. And to get there, you take a bus and walk through a few neighborhood streets and up the garden path and around the front area. And it's a little hard to see in this light, but the house sports wonderful ivy in the autumn. So it's a very beautiful place. It's been restored to look extremely good. The gardens are very well kept. And it's a real pleasure to be there, to live there. And one of my responsibilities was to kind of help with the garden. And I didn't end up getting a picture of it, but there's actually a clipping of a plant that's grown from something that was in G.K. Chesterton's wife's bridal bouquet. And so there's this plant in the corner that is from Mrs. Chesterton, and of course I was absolutely petrified that I would kill it. And I was so afraid that I would overwater it or underwater it, because you can't get that back. And so it did responsibility that comes with being around the kilns and being in charge of the kilns. I mean, there are some things there that they are irreplaceable, and the weight is heavy sometimes. So this is the front door, and I would always begin a tour in a room that we call the common room. And I have to apologize, my font didn't transfer, so there will be some capitalization issues because my original formatting was all caps, so I'm sorry about that. But the common room, the front area, kind of the type of room that I think a lot of us would immediately picture someone like Lewis working in and living in. It's full of books, comfortable chairs, desks, fireplaces, pipes, ashtrays, all of the things that we, I think, associate with our sort of favorite gentleman scholar. So we started in the common room, and the common room has been restored to look like it did during the earliest days that Lewis lived there. So as we go through the house, you'll see that the house has actually been kind of recreated over that span of 30 to 40 years that Lewis's household was there. So I'm really glad that they did that, actually, because it helps us as tour guides to take people through the history, both of Lewis's life and kind of what things were like during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so this is the 30s. This is kind of a very bachelor-feeling room, especially if you're actually in it. The ceiling is stained with smoke because, of course, the two brothers, Lewis and Morny, smoked a lot, all the time. And there were ashtrays everywhere. And actually, how many of you know the name Walter Cooper? Just so a fair amount of you. Okay. So Walter is basically the literary executor of the Lewis estate. He's a wonderful man, very fun to be around, absolutely charming. And he loves to tell stories. If you are lucky enough to get him to come up to the Kilns, he's 80-something now, so it's pretty rare, but he'll come up and he'll, maybe once a year, he'll regale everyone with tales of what it was like when he was there. So he remembers the Lewis brothers pretty much tipping out the ash from their pipes right out onto the carpet. And they said that it kept away moths, and so that was okay. And Walter Hooper was like, "Could I buy you some ashtrays? Like, I will buy you some ashtrays," and he did, and they still just didn't use them. So it was a very smoky place, very ash coated. I'm sorry to say. And it's a little bit difficult to see in this picture, but the curtains on the walls in this room are army blankets, and these were a throwback from World War II when everyone needed blackout curtains, and so the Lewis brothers kind of just left theirs up. They figured blankets are fine. Who cares? This is kind of a bachelor house. So this is the front room, the common room. And let's see, another angle of the room. Yes, so large sofa, lots of space for tutorials and tours and various meetings. So people would come. We'd start out here and talk a little bit about where each visitor was from. People came from all over the world, really. And so we would take a little time to talk about why they were interested in the Kilns and what had brought them there and what they were hoping to find. And it was always very satisfying to meet everyone. And of course, above the fireplace is a framed map of Narnia drawn by Pauline Baines, and these are quite rare. It's very hard to find this print nowadays, but it wasn't there when Lewis was, obviously, but it's been put in place kind of to honor the work that went on in a room like this. And so one thing I like to point out to people in this room is we can very quickly, at a glance, tell just how much Lewis wrote. You can see that obviously there are bookshelves lining the walls. This is true throughout the house. This was a very, very bookish, overflowing with books kind of household. And so we decided to put all of Lewis's books in this front room. That probably wouldn't have been the case. He was very modest by all accounts, and probably wouldn't have put his library front and center like this, but we do, so that people can see right away. So he wrote everything up on my top shelf and everything on the middle shelf and about 3/4 of the way down on that third shelf. So just, if you take a second and think about that, that's an awful lot of pages. It's just years and years of work and extraordinary output, actually, because I think a lot of us tend to think of one or two things. When we think of Lewis, we think of either Narnia or something like New Christianity, and sort of latch onto maybe a book or two that's been very important for us. And we don't think of him as also an essayist and a poet and a literary critic and a researcher, a writer of adult fiction and children's fiction, and all of these different things. And so you just glance right away and see how much he wrote and just really realize how saturated he was by the written word. And you get a sense of him being one of these people who sort of can't think, I think, without a pen in his hand. I mean, he's always writing letters or writing something, writing in the margins of his books, apparently, just capaciously. We do not have his library anymore. It was divided at his death and then sent to a couple of different places. I'm very sorry about that because apparently he wrote in his books all the time. It would be really wonderful to see what he put in his copy of Pride and Prejudice. So that's his books would have been here. And so at this point, it's kind of useful to step back a little and look at the trajectory of Lewis's life up to this point, just before we go any further in the house. And for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with the details of Lewis's biography, so we'll just step back a little bit. So Lewis was born, obviously, in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I think a lot of us think of him as English because we think, oh, Anglophile, Lewis, green country pastures, and think of him as so British, and of course he was Irish. He spent the first near decade of his life in Belfast, and kind of identified as Irish a little bit in contrast to his English friends that told him for the rest of his years. So he was born in Belfast, and of course he has one brother, Warren, who was about 2.5 years older, and the two of them grew up, probably by all accounts, fairly happily for the first 9 or 10 years of Lewis's life. And so, once again, the country around Belfast. So if you go to Belfast, you can see Little Lee, the name of the house, was Rotman. I was only in Belfast for about a day. I never got to Lewis's house, but so this is the country that he was surrounded by. And in Surprised by Joy, which is Lewis's autobiography published in 1955, he draws attention to just sort of 2 episodes of his childhood that he thinks are sort of formative. And one of them, of course, is what he recalls as his first memory of what he calls joy. And it happened here in Belfast when he was about 5 or 6. His older brother Warren brought in a little box of sort of twigs and leaves, sort of a little tiny miniature garden. And the 5-year-old Lewis kind of thrilled inside, and he remembers this feeling just kind of flooding through him and not really having a name for it, not really understanding what it was, but loving it and wanting it back and kind of spending the rest of his life in search of this feeling. And so this is what he refers to in the title, Surprised by Joy. This is the joy. The German word Sehnsucht. It's kind of hard to translate, but joy is the best thing that we can do. Also during this period, C.S. Lewis decided to go by Jack. He decided he had enough of being Clive by the time he was 4. He decided I'm going to be Jaxie, and for the rest of his life, his intimates called him Jack. So that's also what here in Belfast. Unfortunately, the other major thing that happened to him while he was still a young boy was that his mother died when he was about 9. And so after this, a lot of things changed. Warren and Lewis were both sent overseas to England to school. Their father felt they needed taking care of, and he wasn't really equipped to do so. And it was also a priority for a Northern Irish family to be able to give their sons a prep school, an English public school experience. And so the boys came across the sea, and Lewis's first thought was that England was not green enough. Ireland was so much greener, and he just hated it here in England. And unfortunately, his first stage of English life was very unhappy. He landed at a terrible school called Wynyard, and the headmaster was later declared legally insane. And so this was the inspiration for things like the Experiment House and the Silver Chair, and kind of responsible for Lewis's reservations about public school culture. It lives throughout his work. You see a lot of kind of critiquing of the educational system, what's wrong with it, where he feels it goes wrong, and a lot of that comes from these early years at a very dysfunctional school that was already on top of a traumatic incident of his mother dying. So these were very difficult, very tough years, really, all said and done. And they didn't really improve until Lewis was about 16 or so. And at this point, he was sent to study for a couple of years with his father's one of his father's old tutors, Professor Kirkpatrick. Does the phrase Professor Kirk mean anything to anybody in this room? I see some kind of smiles, but somebody just tell us what it means. Professor Kirk, someone.
It means church.
Yes, it does.
Well, he's a character.
He's a
in the
character.
Narnia books.
Yes.
Is the host for the children when they find or
The professor, yes. So the children land in this household of this professor, Professor Kirk. We find out is his name. And Lewis looked back on these years as the happiest of his life. He credits Professor Kirkpatrick with teaching him how to be a thinker, how to understand the world critically, and it was citing a real passion for learning and ideas, and then letting him run with the incredible brain power that he had, and kind of just letting him loose and teaching him, and just really bringing him, I think, up to the level of the kind of thinker that he was to become at university. And so the express purpose of Lewis studying Kirkpatrick was to prepare for entrance exams to Oxford, which he dutifully sat and won a scholarship. So he matriculated in, I believe it was 1914. Unfortunately, World War I was actually just about to break out, and so right in the middle of Lewis's studies, he was sent to wage war, and he fought for a while in France, eventually came home wounded. But during the war years, he was put in a regiment with another young man from Northern Ireland named Patrick Moore. And the two young men became very good friends. They introduced each other to their families before they left, and while they were deployed, they promised each other that if one of them died, the other one would look after the remaining relatives. And so Patty Moore actually was unfortunately killed in battle, and so Jack came home and recuperated, and then took very seriously that promise to look after Mrs. Moore, to the extent, actually, that he moved in with Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen for the rest of his college career, and would count Mrs. Moore among his household until her death in 1948. So this is like 30 years, 3 decades of keeping this promise and honoring this vow. And so she was, always a huge background presence in Lewis's life for a significant portion of it, and that starts here. And it's remarkable actually, because at that time it was not only frowned upon, but actually prohibited for young Oxford man to live outside of college walls with a woman who's not related to him. And so if he had been discovered, he actually could have been expelled. So this is a very serious thing that he did. It's a kind of high-stakes decision. His father didn't know about it. Like it was sort of a secretive move, and it's naturally incited some controversy and some speculation. But we certainly do know this was a very serious thing, and this was a relationship he treated very seriously. And so Lewis basically, but he kind of blew through his studies, did extremely well. Basically, double majored in classics and ancient languages, and so he passed his final exams with flying colors, did extremely well, and kind of decided that he would then embark upon an academic career. As any young academic knows, it's hard to get started, even in those days when the market wasn't nearly as competitive as it is now. So Lewis came out of Oxford. He kind of thought, I'm all set, I did everything right, I have great recommendations, I've got this double first, which is like saying a double 4.0. Why aren't I getting called for fellowships? And so unfortunately, the competition was so stiff that he didn't get anything for at least a year. And so one of his advisors recommended that he go back and get another BA in English literature. Now, Lewis actually thought this was a dumb idea. He looked down on English majors. He thought they were grubby and kind of dumb and just not cool like classics people are. And so he was kind of not excited about this plan B, English literature, like that's for softies. But he went through with it because he thought, well, okay, I will be more marketable, and maybe I can sort of find an English post and sort of edge into classics and get back to what I really love. So happily, he took another first in English literature, which means he was a triple first at Oxford. This is quite rare, quite a feat to have accomplished. Triple first at Oxford. He did land a fellowship at Malvern College in English literature at that time. And so here he was, kind of having made it. At Magdalen, which is great, in English, not so great. But the way he did English, it was full of classics and full of ancient languages, and so it kind of made it work anyway. But so during these years, basically, he was busy starting an academic career. He had kind of almost formally left behind any Christian devotion or any affiliation with religion as about a 14-year-old or so. He just kind of said, look, I prayed and my mom didn't live. I don't see the point. This isn't working for me. And then as he grew older, especially under the influence of Professor Kirkpatrick, he found that Christianity just wasn't logical, and it wasn't materially provable, and it wasn't kind of all of these typical sort of objections that people come up with for it. And so by the time he was a young academic, he just really had no use for it. He felt that Christianity wasn't for thinking people. Kind of a number of objections I think that he would come to revisit and anticipating other people later after he had converted himself. And so, yeah, so he got to Oxford, and one thing I kind of neglected to mention was that he ended up at the Kilns, I think partly because Oxford is kind of a cluttered and crowded place. Like, the first time I went there, I was really surprised by just how close to everything is happening, and there's, you know, a gargoyle or a tower or something, like, everywhere you look. And so, this is a building called the Exam School. This is where Lewis would have sat both his entrance and his exit exams. And the Oxford system is different on the undergraduate level, especially from what we have here. Instead of taking 4 years of sort of general ed and then major courses and getting grades all the way through and having an average at the end, you don't really get grades for the first 3. You spend 3 years at Oxford, you don't really get grades, you kind of get progress reports. But at the end, your whole degree, your whole ranking is dependent on this one series of exams, your final exams. And so it's a huge deal. Your whole life kind of revolves around 2 weeks at the end of your senior year. And that can determine, you know, your career prospects. And it's terribly nerve-wracking, but here's where you go to take them. And so in order to do anything, including take exams at Oxford, you have to wear a uniform. And it's called sub-fusk. Any Latinate folks care to talk about what fusk means? What does fusk mean? A touch.
Oh, brown.
Yeah, dark brown, yes. So sub-fusk means you have to wear not only the gown that signifies your university status, whether you're an undergraduate or a master's student or a DPhil, whatever you are, you have to wear a dark suit underneath it. And so your gown and your suit kind of together show your rank and your position within the university. So when you have exams, you get dressed up, you wear your tuxedo, and it's a huge occasion. And actually when finalists are taking their exams, depending on where they are in their exam, they wear a different colored flower in their buttonhole. So if you're like starting your exam, you wear a white carnation, and if you're in the middle, you wear pink, and then if you're finishing up, you wear red. So that people see you and know, like you see someone in the grocery store with a pink carnation, you kind of look sympathetically at them. Like there's, you know, they wear these flowers to get a lot of these looks that we're all like, you know, we're pulling for you. We know what you're going through. It's awful. And so anyway, that's the kind of culture that Oxford is, and that's the kind of world that Lewis lived in and participated in as both a student and a professor. And so this is the gateway to a place called the Sheldonian Theater. It's where you go both when you matriculate, which is kind of formally enter the university, and then when you graduate, which is when you leave the university. So Lewis would have spent lots and lots of time in here attending graduations as well as, of course, participating for the first time in his own. And this is one of my favorite buildings. It's called the Radcliffe Camera. It's one of the libraries in the Bodleian system. It's very famous. It's like one of the iconic parts of the Oxford skyline. And so once again, just kind of a quick tour of Lewis Oxford. This is the gateway to the main section of the Bodleian Library. It's called the Tower of 5 Orders, because it has a column from each of the architectural orders on each level. So there's Ionic, Doric, Corinthian, and so forth. And then the upper reading room. So obviously these things are largely unchanged from the way that Lewis saw them, except that they're a lot cleaner. You see photos from Lewis's day. There's soot all over all of these buildings, and they have recently cleaned them, which means when I was there was always like one half of the building to be covered up, which was kind of a shame. But they're back to their kind of golden glory now, so it was worth it. And so once again, this is kind of just the environment that Lewis would have been living among. And this is just a quick map of Oxford, probably to show you how closely packed together all these things are. Every time you can see a little mortar board. That's a college, so there are 39 colleges in the Oxford system, and they're all just crammed. Tolkien said, look, you love all this ancient mythology, you love all these old stories, this sort of romance of the pagan world, but take a look at the Gospels, because this is the formative part of faith, and it doesn't have to be a series of dry doctrines or it doesn't have to be boring or all the things that he thought it was. And so basically, as you'll be told, I think if you ask anyone around Mom especially, is that finally one night Lewis and Toby and a couple of other guys went walking around and around Addison's Walk late into the night, and so I have a few more pictures in the pathway, just kind of hashing this out. Just Mom has deer, it has its own deer, which is fun to look at. So they went around and I was walking. Actually, there's now a plaque of a poem written by Lewis, and I'll pause here. But they went around and around Addison's Walk, which is about a mile circumference. So this is quite a long evening. And Addison's Walk is not lit. There's sort of a ferocious tradition of it not being lit because it's named after Joseph Addison, as in Addison and Steele for the 1700s newspaper man. And so they, Oxford has kind of clung to this unique view the way it was in the 1700s. So they were kind of stumbling around this very dark path, and if you don't watch it, you can fall into the river. Like the river's right there. So they were walking around, and Lewis writes in a letter later that this was the evening that he kind of really felt himself becoming at least a theist again. He said he returned to his room after this evening of walking, arguing, and he knelt by his bed. And he said that he, the most reluctant convert in all of England, knelt and prayed for the first time in 15 years probably. And just think about that for a second. It's not a conversion narrative that's like, oh, and then it was all sunshine and I was happy. It was like, no, I was the most reluctant convert in all of England. This was kind of an uncomfortable, difficult experience. I'm not sure where I've arrived at. I don't really know how I feel about this, but it's not sweetness and light yet. This was in about 1927. So Lewis kind of was ambling along his journey, at least toward a sense of theism. This is from kind of the furthest point of Addison's Walk out from on the tower. So you kind of see the tower all the way around. This is from kind of halfway around. So back in the cloisters of Magdalen College, and again, just kind of surrounding yourself with his iconography. So this is the Magdalen Chapel. So chapel in Oxford colleges kind of they do beautiful evensong. Magdalen is lucky to have a boy choir. Not every college in Oxford does. There are only 2 or 3 that do. They have a resident choir school, so these guys are good. They're tiny and they're extremely good because they spend all their time singing. They sing, daily morning prayers and daily evensong and Sunday services, and they're highly trained. And it's a highly competitive thing to get your boy in one of these choirs. It's a huge deal in England if your boy ends up in the Magdalen boy choir. It's just fantastic. And so you can see every college has a chapel, something like this, and you can come for evensong, evening services, Sunday services. So Lewis probably would have been kind of a nominal presence at college chapel because chapel was also kind of just the thing you did in college community. It didn't necessarily reflect your level of faith and commitment. It was a little bit less strenuous than that. And so this is the chapel. And so basically, Lewis spent the next 2 or 3 years, late 20s into the early 30s, so still kind of exploring and talking to Tolkien and reading a lot. And he doesn't give us a lot of information in Surprised by Joy or in his memoirs or anything about his final conversion to Christianity, from kind of praying and being a reluctant convert to actually feeling like he's a full-fledged Christian. Kind of the only anecdote we have is really strange. He said that he was riding to the zoo in his brother Morty's motorcycle. He was in the sidecar, and he said when he left the house, I wasn't a Christian. When we got to the zoo, I was. And that's all we have. So for Lewis, he doesn't, the conversion narrative isn't the focal point of his story ever. He's much more interested in talking about the substance of what he is defending. And so this was a nice tranquil room, kind of compared to some of the other aspects of the house. So this looks right out on the garden, and there's kind of a forest beyond the house. And when Lewis lived there, there wasn't any sort of trellis, there wasn't a fence. It just looked right out onto Shelley's pond and the forest around it. So there's actually this pond right behind the back of the house, and Lewis loves to swim there. I don't know if the algae was as bad in 1930 as it is now, but every year, like in the summer, it's kind of awful, but he talks about swimming there quite a lot. He loves to swim, apparently. He just loves being in the water. And he and Maureen would go up there many mornings. And this is, Shelley's Pond is named after Percy Shelley. Nobody's quite sure why, but the poet Percy Shelley, who did go to Oxford until he was expelled. He had something to do with his pond up here, apparently. Nobody knows why. And so beyond the forest, if you kind of keep walking through the forest behind the Kilns, you see the sort of broader countryside. And Lewis describes walking on Shotover, like he talks about that a lot in his letters and his diaries. And this is the area that he means. And you can kind of break through his woods behind his house, you get to this area called Shotover. This is kind of, the name dates way back to the Middle Ages. Like a lot of the stuff around here has very ancient connotations, and a lot of the names have not changed. Headington, Risinghurst, and Shotover. So this is a very ancient area, and I'm sure who was kind of thrilled to know that. And so the first room of the house, usually we kind of talk about Lewis's sort of bachelor life, and kind of his development as a scholar and a writer through the 30s and 40s. So after his conversion, Lewis kind of looked around at his life and he said, I kind of have the totally wrong job. Like, I don't actually want to be a tutor. I want to be something more faithful. I want to be a preacher, something that involves using my faith on a daily basis now that I have it, and I'm so excited about it. And I'm teaching kids who don't appreciate it, teaching 19-year-olds, and he was quite impatient with them, especially like, as an early tutor. He was kind of, he didn't have a lot of time for them. Kind of the things teenagers and undergraduates do. He just had no patience. And so it took him a few years to kind of learn how to work that into his job and to treat it like more of a vocation and more of an opportunity to live out this space that he's so excited about. So throughout the 30s, he's kind of settling into his academic life, published his first major work, Allegory of Love, a book of medieval criticism, in 1936. And so he's quite busy and kind of working on a number of informal, personal poetry, fiction projects. The inklings are kind of getting going. And so really throughout the 30s, kind of settling into several identities that would sort of be defining for him. A professor, Christian, writer, things that we tend to sort of think of him as. This is the decade that he was kind of exploring all of that. So the study is kind of meant to show those sort of bachelor years when he's really just focusing on becoming a writer amid the tumult of the rest of the house. And so usually then I would take visitors across the hall to the next room, the dining room. And it's a little difficult to see in this light, but the dining room, by contrast with the study, has been restored to look much more finished. Usually, if I had younger students, I would say what you notice is different about the room. And things like there are velvet curtains on the window instead of army blankets, like they're actually curtains. And there's like china on display, cabinets, and it's all very civilized, and paintings on the walls. It's much more feminine, right? And so then we talk about how this was the way the house would have looked after Joy, David, and Gresham moved in the mid-1950s. And so how many of you are familiar with the story of Shadowlands? The film, the play, show of hands, so moderately. And so on about 1948, Mrs. Moore was pretty old and sick, and she was taken to a rest home, and she died in 1948. And so after this period, Lewis was much more of a bachelor. Maureen was kind of in and out of the house. Maureen had grown up and moved away. So Lewis was kind of just entering middle-aged bachelordom for all he knew. This American woman named Joy Gresham struck up a correspondence. She was a recent convert herself, and she really appreciated Lewis's writing. At this time, he had published things like Screwtape Letters and Four Loves and The Problem of Pain, and some of his early works, and she really resonated with what he had to say. And so she wrote to him, and he tried to write back to everyone who wrote to him, so he wrote back. And then she wrote back, and then he was like, okay, I will write back. And you can see where this went. So she kept writing, and finally in the early 50s, she got over to Oxford to visit and met with Lewis and his brother downtown in a hotel across the street from Malvern College. He came to visit the Kilns, and at this time, of course, she was married to her husband, Bill Gresham. Unfortunately, Joy went home from that trip to discover that her husband wanted a divorce so that he could marry her cousin. Ouch. So she decided to move to England because yes, you would. And so she moved up and took a house in Headington, which is the village between Oxford and the Kilns. If you remember from the map, there's kind of that big stretch in the middle. Headington is the thing in the middle. So she lived in Headington for a while, until, of course, it was discovered that she had very advanced stage bone cancer. She ended up in a hospital, and she was not expected to live more than a few weeks. And so Lewis, and I'm sorry, I skipped a huge part of the story. And so while Joy was in the middle of kind of trying to settle in, her visa, her green card renewal was denied, and so she was going to be kicked out of the country. And so Lewis offered to marry her in secret on a purely kind of platonic business arrangement sort of way so that she could retain her residency, and they did this. Just a few months before she was found to be so ill. And so she went to hospital. She was thought to have a matter of weeks, as I said. And it was during this time that Lewis asked a friend of his to come and marry the two of them in the fullest Christian sense of the word. So they had decided by this time that the business arrangement was no longer the full story, that they wanted to commit to each other in the sight of God, in the sight of everyone, as husband and wife. And so this they did. And so they were married in the hospital by one of Lewis's friends. And Joy was brought back to the Kilns and set up in the common room, the front study there, and they thought she would probably die very soon. And a few weeks went by, and then a few months went by, and she didn't. She went to remission. And one of the first things she did was fix the place up because it was covered with ash and had marking blankets on the windows. It was, people used to not come to the Kilns because they thought they would get food poisoning. Seriously. So she said, no. Here's how we do things. And so the dining room was meant to reflect the way the Kilns was probably at the height of its elegance. And it's quite nice. There's things to like about that. And so there are some pictures of Joy around the dining room area. And that's when we sort of bring her into the story and talk about her presence there. So this is the Eastgate Hotel across the street from Magdalen College, which is where Jack and Joy first met. They obviously we've done the lounge, the loungers, it's a bit of a pet tea, kind of met the way pen pals do, which is awkward and then apparently get it off. So this is the two of them sitting in the garden. Joy's on the left, and this is probably in about 1956. So they were married in 1956, and Joy ended up being in remission for just over 3 years. She died in July of 1960. So they always felt that every day they had was a bonus because they didn't expect to have any of it. So they, endeavored to be as happy as they could while she was alive. So she was there for kind of 1955-ish on. She was a pretty big part of Lewis's life. This is the period in which he finished Till We Have Faces, which is the novel that a lot of people see Joy's thumbprint on a little bit, thematically and stylistically even. And people kind of either love it or hate it. It's a really interesting one because people do tend to react fairly strongly. It was kind of also, Lewis was finishing up the Chronicles of Narnia throughout this period. So the 50s, Chronicles of Narnia, Till We Have Faces, Mere Christianity, and so forth. I'll kind of come back to those in a minute. But so he was pretty busy and taking care of her. And of course, she had 2 boys. In the film, there's only one, but there are 2, David and Douglas. David has returned his Jewish roots and doesn't have any connection with the Lewis estate at all. Douglas has a little. He comes by the house every so often, and he turned out to be the heir to the copyright. So he kind of owns the lion's share of the Lewis estate now. So that's who was living there with Joy in the late 1950s. And so once again, dining room, flowers, lots of kind of later Kilns sorts of things. And so the house doesn't have very many original artifacts, but this is actually one of them. This is a gong that Morning Lewis brought back from his time overseas. He was a military man and he spent time in Japan, and this is what he brought home. And he also brought home a taste for curry and photography and kind of usually just a slightly more adventuresome spirit than Jack. Morning was the one with the gadgets, the typewriter and motorbike and the gramophone and all these things that kind of Lewis couldn't touch. Like he would not learn to type and he didn't learn to drive because he just thought machinery was his way, not where he belonged. And so I didn't get a picture of it, but the dining room also has a typewriter that belonged to Morning, and this typewriter, really important symbol of Morning's role in the house. He answer thousands of letters on that typewriter. Had it for 30 years. He died. He was a very, very dedicated journaler. He wrote just capacious diaries. He wrote about everything. He was just, both those brothers, I don't think, you can't think without a pen in your hand, I think. This is how both of them kind of went through life. And so we have just voluminous amounts of just description for Morty. And so, I think it's very easy to look at Morty and go, oh, the alcoholic brother, kind of not really go further than that. But there's some really interesting research right now going on about Morty's role in the house, Morty's presence in the Inklings, kind of his contribution to those communities as much more than kind of just a needy person or kind of a parasite. It was much more of a symbiotic, kind of mutually dependent relationship, I think. Morty contributed a lot. He was apparently really clever, really fun to be around, quite charming, and very, very kind, apparently, just unfailingly sweet. And you kind of get that from his pictures. So anyway, this is the gong that Morty brought back from Japan. And it's in the hallway, just a couple doors down from Joy's bedroom. So when she recovered, Joy was given a ground floor room. And it's hard to see in these photos. I'm sorry about that, but there are two pictures of her. Go back to the other one, hanging up. You can sort of barely see them. But on the right is a picture from 1952, which was taken for her passport. On the left picture is from 1956. So it's really hard to see this, but the change in her appearance is absolutely staggering because she's gone through near mortal illness and kind of primitive cancer treatment. And she goes from looking like 30 to looking like 65. It's just really, really striking. And kind of a wonderful testament to her attitude and her spirit, which were, by all accounts, quite formidable. And the next door down was a large room that Morty had. He had a large room to himself with a kind of little study off that room. And again, he was quite a writerly, readerly person himself. This was a very scholarly household. Morty went to military school instead of college, but he was extremely well read. And I think he was one of the few people who could sort of meet Jack on his intellectual level. Like, despite Morty's issues, he is likely to have read most of the things that Jack was reading. They would talk about things as colleagues, much more than as kind of roommates even. So this was a very, very close relationship, very key. Neither of them sort of could bear to be away from the other one for very long. Although Morty would sometimes disappear back up to Ireland on drinking trips, and Lewis would have to come kind of fish him out of a hospital, and this was a recurring thing. And so again, this is the backdrop for things that we think of as kind of serene and abstract, and kind of Lewis writing this theology kind of just because he doesn't have anything else to do or something. And of course, no, he's writing amid chaos. He's living with two people who are kind of liable to go off in any minute for a couple of decades. And so again, it's hard to talk about this stuff. Some visitors come kind of not very willing to hear about things like this. They're difficult. And when I first moved in, I had a hard time talking about them as a tour guide because I thought, I don't want to shatter people's illusions. And the Kilns now looks like a very charming place. It is kind of a charming existence, but it's something that makes me even more aware of the potency of Lewis's faith, of the personal experience with which he does write. To me, it just adds gravity and power to what he writes because he's not simply saying, well, being Christian is a good idea, kind of in theory. He's saying, no, struggles are real. I totally know about that. You have no idea, actually, how much I know the struggle is real and how frail humanity is. And he certainly had first-person contact with that through his household and through himself, of course. So once again, Morty's study. And when Morty actually lived 10 years longer than Jack. Morty died in 1973. And the house was actually purchased in the name of Mrs. Moore. She was the one whose name was on the title. So when Jack died, Morty had a lifetime interest in it. But when he died, the house passed to Maureen Moore, the daughter. She had actually gotten married to someone and ended up with the title. Like, she ended up a duchess because somebody on her father's side of the family had this title and it passed to her. So she was fine. She was off being a duchess. And so the house was sold to a family who decided to add a garage. And so when the house was restored in the late 1980s by the Lewis Foundation, this was turned into basically a library and a conference room. And I only show it to you because in it is hanging the original sign from the pub The Eagle and Child, which is of course where the Inklings met every Thursday morning, every Tuesday afternoon for quite a long time. And so the pub itself was renovated in the late 80s, and Walter Hooper decided that he wanted the sign, and they were just going to throw it out. And they actually were going to let him have it, and they threw it on a rubbish heap, and he actually just went in there and took it out and carried it away because he thought that it should be preserved. And he was graciously allowed the foundation to hang it here. Walter's apartment is kind of small, and he's filled it with Greek statuary, so there's no room for this. So this is the original sign. It says Ein Coop, which is actually the brewer who owned the franchise that owned the pub. Pub signs traditionally haven't had words on them because historically people couldn't read, and so that's why pubs are named things like the Rose and Crown or like the Swan, like things that you can draw so that you can draw a picture and tell people I'll meet you with the bird and the baby, with the eagle and the child. So this is the original sign of the place where the Inklings would meet and drink quite a lot. Walter Hooper tells an anecdote that Lewis said one morning after 3 pints that he was going to take it easy because it's Lent. So it gives you an idea of how much he is used to drinking. So they had a great time by all accounts. So Eagle and Child is located kind of in the northwest corner of Oxford, just down the street from the Oxford Oratory, which is the parish actually where Priscilla Tolkien and Walter Hooper currently worship, and they're currently very active there. So Eagle and Child right there. The Oxford C.S. Lewis Society, which meets every Tuesday evening, has its meetings a couple doors away from here, and then retreats to Eagle and Child for a Tuesday evening beer. So that's always fun. So anyhow, back to the house. This is a 2-story house. It's kind of deceptively large. From the pictures, you sort of don't get the sense of how many rooms there are. So in Language and the Order, when Lewis talks about the professor's house and having all of these corridors and staircases, I don't think he was necessarily talking about the Kilns, but you can start feeling like that when you're wandering around and shepherding people through all of these rooms, because there really are quite a lot. But upstairs, there's an attic door and a small attic, and in the room next to this, which used to be, it's quite a large bedroom, used to be Maureen's room. Lewis actually hosted 4 refugee children during World War II, just like Peter, Edmund, Susan, and Lucy. They came and slept in that room, and so there's been a lot of speculation that they spent a lot of time in that attic playing. And of course, Lewis published Language and the Wardrobe in 1948, and he began writing it somewhere in there. And the dedication to Lucy Barfield, Language and the Wardrobe. Lucy Barfield was Owen Barfield's daughter. Owen was one of the Inklings, he was an attorney, he was a very close friend of Lewis's. Actually a very valuable person in Lewis's life because Lewis was unfailingly generous with his money. And when he started to make some from all of this writing that he was doing so well with, he actually gave away too much one year and ended up behind on his taxes. And so he kind of said to Owen, look, I'm not good with money, you're an attorney, can you please make sure this doesn't happen again? So Owen Barfield is very important kind of getting the estate together, and when Lewis died, Owen and Walter Hooper were kind of the people who took care of it. But anyway, Lucy Barfield had some kind of disease that kept her from being active. I don't remember whether it was MS or something kind of like that though, so she wasn't able to live a kind of normal childhood life, and she would be watching other kids play. So Lewis wrote Language and the Wardrobe for her, actually, and so that's the Lucy in the dedication. And it's wonderful when he, in the introduction says something like, well, this book started out when you were a little girl, and girls grow faster than books, and so I'm sure you're just going to put it on the shelf until you are once again old enough to enjoy fairy tales again. And so these 4 children, plus Lucy Barfield, kind of, I think, are a little bit of the background for Narnia. Much of which was written actually in this room. This is the upstairs study, and this is the room that had formerly been Mrs. Moore's bedroom. She slept up here till 1948, of course, when she was moved out of the house. And at this time, Lewis took it over as his own place to write. So it's thought that lots of Narnia, Till We Have Faces, a lot of the later fiction, was written in this room. And there he is, right away in the room, which you can see. And if you look closely, this is a series of photographs a similar afternoon or something, some of the most iconic images of Lewis come from, he's wearing a very heavy dressing gown, this sort of house coat, and he wore that all the time, and that's because, in the 1940, 47, 48, following World War II, England was actually very cold and hungry. I hadn't really thought about this a lot before living in the Kilns, but the post-war, the war didn't end with sudden prosperity. They had several bad harvests. They had some years go by that were really, really mean. And this included people like Lewis. I think we tend to assume that somebody like Lewis would be relatively sheltered from things like that, and not really. The whole country was feeling the pinch, and so coal would have been scarcer. The house would have been cold, and Lewis actually received a number of packages from American readers. Is anybody in here familiar with the book 84 Charing Cross Road, where this American writer sends packages across the pond to this group who owns, group in the London bookshop? A wonderful little book. You should go read it. It's very charming. It's a true story, and it's a series of letters between these two people. But so Lewis was the beneficiary of some of these American boxes full of things like eggs and ham and sort of rationed items that otherwise would have been very hard to get. So he got things like that, and somebody sent him a whole suit of clothes at some point. So his American readers were quite generous. It's a wonderful thing to know about, because again, it just shows a tremendous amount of goodwill that kind of was flowing through his life. He was likewise very generous with what he received. He would spread these boxes out with his friends and say, pick something. And he would share everything he had with everyone around him. And so once again, just when you see his pictures, look for the pictures with the dressing gown, because that was part of his attire. That's a symbol of kind of daily hardship on a level that I don't think we think about with someone like Lewis. And so here he is writing, and of course, cigarette in one hand, pen in the other, probably how it was for much of the time, but also big cup of tea. One of my favorite Lewis quotations is that you can never have a book long enough or a cup of tea large enough to suit me. One of my favorites, and very Lewis. And so through the room that we just were in, you get Jack's bedroom. It's a very small room comparatively. So you go through that study. So, thinking about the logistics of this would have meant that while Mrs. Moore was in the house, the only way to his room was through her room. And so, obviously, the quality of this relationship, the exact nature of it, has been speculated about a lot because of that kind of geographical details like that are just a little puzzling. But so this was his room, though, for the whole of his residence there, except for the very final weeks when he was in healthy and declined stairs. So it's a very small, very modest room. I got to sleep in this room my first year there. It's kind of a mixed blessing because you can't have any personal items out. The house is like a living museum, so no postcards, no pictures. And that blanket on the bed is kind of an antique coverlet, so I had to take it off every night if I wanted to sleep in bed, and then I had to put it back in the morning. So I learned the next year to sleep in a room that wasn't as interesting, so that I could just shut the door. If I didn't want my room on display, I could just say, it's Maureen's room. Nothing there. So this is Lewis's bedroom. And of course, you can see from the outside of the house there was this staircase that they had installed. There's this door, so that eventually Lewis did get in and out of his room via the outside. And there's a bathroom at the base of that staircase, kind of an outdoor loo that he would have used, was put in for the middle of the night, but still very cold, very uncomfortable, and awkward. But that's how it was, and the staircase is still in place, and that is just simply a fact of the layout of the house. And the house has kind of extensive space around it. When it was purchased, it was kind of the only thing in the neighborhood. All those other houses you see were not there when Lewis and Warnie and Mrs. Moore moved in at first. And so really it was quite solitary until this development went in the 50s and 60s. So, but the Kilns has apple trees the photo also is Douglas Gresham, whose room is just off the kitchen. If you take a look at the stove, it's kind of hard to see here, but it's a particular kind of stove. It's called an aga, and it's everyone in England who has one loves it. It's kind of a special thing to have. It's kind of not a stove, it's a lifestyle. They will tell you that. It's always on. It's gas lit. There's no temperature dial. It's just on at whatever temperature it's on. And there's kind of a hot oven and then an even hotter one. And then on top there are a couple of boilers that you lift the lid and you can do stovetop cooking. But it is unlike anything I can think of over here. And it takes a long time to learn how to cook properly on it because it's so hot that you sort of have to cover things immediately or they get burnt. And it's quite an adventure. So people who come live at the Kilns have to reckon with this marvelous oven and kind of learn to deal with it. It's quite an adventure. And once again, the kitchen, and from the kitchen window, and a couple of containers of plums. I mean, those plum trees give and give, so it's pretty amazing. And then finally, of course, the hallway outside the kitchen is a wardrobe. And of course, people would often come asking to see the wardrobe. And unfortunately, the wardrobe that's likely the wardrobe is at the Wheaton Center, or the Wade Center in Wheaton College. And so obviously it's over here. But this was a very serviceable one, and it's a good point to stop and especially the children, and to have a photo section and have a wardrobe in the house. And there are like 11. One of our residents counted. He was like, well, there are 11 wardrobes. I mean, because they are everywhere in the furnishing of the time. So the house is actually full of wardrobes. None of which are terribly evocative, but the thinking is that the wardrobe was actually carved by one of Lewis's grandfathers, and so there is kind of a sense of family connection, and it is a piece of artwork. I mean, there is a sense of craftsmanship. This one is kind of a run-of-the-mill, very basic one, but by all accounts, the one at the Wade Center is kind of supposed to be a family piece of some stature. Sorry about that. And so during the final years of Lewis's life, he actually was offered a teaching post at Cambridge. And over the years at Oxford, Lewis had applied for a couple of different positions that he didn't get, full professorship and a couple of other professor of poetry, sort of nice titles that he unfortunately was not selected for. And so Cambridge cooked up this offer of full professor, Magdalen College, Cambridge, which is spelled just like Magdalen College, Oxford, except with an E, they're sister colleges. So Lewis ended up from Magdalen to Magdalen. And he spent the final years of his career teaching and commuting to Cambridge, which is about an hour and a half drive from Oxford. And so, of course, Joy died in 1960. And so after this time, obviously Lewis went through kind of quite a grief spell. I mean, if you've read Grief Observed or even seen the movie, although I think the play is better, Shadowlands, you know that this experience really did have a toll. It did take a toll on Lewis. He had written The Problem with Pain in about 1948 and kind of had talked his way around suffering a little, I think he thought. And I think he thought he was prepared for what it was like to lose someone even that he hadn't been married to for a lifetime, you know? This had been it's very much the end of his life, kind of, if you add it all up, you know, it's towards the last decade, and yet this had an enormous effect on his life for a while. You know, he questioned everything after this. He said, you know, what kind of God lets a person go through this? What kind of God lets a person go through what Joy was going through and then what I'm going through? And he wrote it all down. He kept these notebooks, and because I think a lot of us who are writerly, readerly types, you know, the only way we're going to make sense of what's going on is we're going to write it down. So he kind of put these notebooks together, and then he